$10,000. That's the fine, payable within 30 days. Case closed. The courtroom gasped. A few people muttered under their breath. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably. Even the stenographer paused typing for a second. Judge Conrad Mallory didn't flinch. He leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, staring coldly at the woman standing in the middle of the courtroom. She was small, with silver hair pulled into a neat bun, wearing a plain gray coat and black dress shoes that had clearly seen many miles. Her glasses sat on the tip of her nose, and she held her hands gently in front of her, almost like a schoolteacher addressing a rowdy class. "Is that all?" she asked calmly, her voice smooth and unbothered. Judge Mallory scoffed. "Is that all? You're being fined for contempt of court, ma'am. $10,000 is the price of disrespect in my courtroom." The woman didn't move, didn't blink, just stare at the judge with a quiet power that made the room feel smaller. Then she said 6 words that would flip the entire courthouse upside down. "Do you know who I am?" The judge chuckled, waving his hand dismissively. "I don't care if you're the mayor's wife. This courtroom runs by my rules." She tilted her head slightly, her voice still calm. "I am Professor Lydia Carrington. I teach constitutional law at Harvard, and you just made a very serious mistake." Gasps filled the room again, this time louder. Someone in the back whispered, "No way." Judge Mallory froze. For the first time all morning, he looked unsure of himself. But it was too late. And now, everything was about to unravel. 2 weeks earlier, the sky over Asheville was cloudy, the kind of gray that made you feel like something important was about to happen. The wind was sharp that morning, whipping through the trees that lined the courthouse steps. Professor Lydia Carrington stepped out of the car slowly, her joints aching from the long ride. She had taken a train from Boston to visit her late sister's property, a small house in Asheville that had recently come under dispute after her passing. At 72 years old, Lydia had seen her share courtrooms, but never as a defendant. She'd spent her life teaching future lawyers and judges, most of whom went on to change the world in one way or another. She'd sat on panels, helped draft legislation, and advised presidents. But today, she was here as just another old lady caught up in a local land dispute. Asheville was a small southern town with a beautiful historic district and a tight-knit community. But underneath its charm was a system that hadn't changed much since the 1960s. And Judge Conrad Mallory was the symbol of that system. Judge Mallory was known around town for his no-nonsense approach to justice. People feared him more than they respected him. His sentences were harsh, his tone colder than stone. And he didn't like being questioned, especially not by someone who looked like Lydia. The case was about a simple mistake, or so Lydia thought. Her sister had left behind a home that sat on a piece of land bordering a local business. The business, run by a man named Carl Dobbins, claimed her sister's fence crossed 2 feet into his property. He demanded it be torn down. Lydia, as the legal heir, was here to sort it out. The hearing was supposed to be a formality, a date to show up, clear up paperwork, and move on. But nothing went as planned. The moment Lydia entered the courtroom, things fell off. The judge didn't look at her. When her name was called, it was mispronounced. When she corrected it, the judge sighed loudly. "Ma'am, let's just move this along. You're only making this harder on yourself." "I beg your pardon?" Lydia asked politely, surprised. "You heard me. You're on thin ice already. You don't get to challenge the court." From there, things escalated quickly. Carl Dobbins presented shaky evidence, an old photo and a hand-drawn map. Lydia pulled out a certified land survey from the county office that proved the fence was exactly where it should be. The judge barely glanced at it. "I'm going to side with Mr. Dobbins," he said without hesitation, "and I'll be ordering the fence removed." Lydia calmly asked to speak. She explained her position clearly. She referenced property law, legal precedent, and county records. That's when Judge Mallory lost his temper. "You've already wasted enough of this court's time with your lectures. One more word out of turn, and I will hold you in contempt." Lydia raised her eyebrows slightly. "You mean to say citing actual law is contempt?" That was the moment he banged the gavel. $10,000 fine for contempt of court. The courtroom froze. But Lydia didn't. She stood taller. And then came her words. "Do you know who I am?" But let's rewind. Because before that explosive moment, Lydia had a long journey to Asheville, and even longer memories tied to this town. She had been born here. Lydia Carrington was once just a quiet, studious girl in Asheville's segregated schools. Her mother worked as a cleaner at the courthouse. Her father, a railroad worker. She grew up walking past the very steps she now climbed as an accused. She left Asheville when she was 17, got a scholarship to Yale, graduated top of her class, then Harvard, then became the youngest black female professor in the history of a university. She never looked back until her sister, Caroline, passed away unexpectedly. Caroline had stayed in Asheville, built a quiet life, never married, worked as a librarian. She and Lydia hadn't spoken much in recent years, not out of anger, just time and distance. But Lydia loved her dearly, and when she got the call, she knew she had come home. Her first few days in Asheville were quiet. The townspeople stared politely. Some remembered her. Others pretended they didn't. She stayed at her sister's house, now dusty and full of old books. On the third day, a notice appeared on the door, summons to court regarding a property violation. She laughed at first, thought it was a mistake. But her laughter faded quickly when she met Carl Dobbins. Dobbins owned the feed store next to Caroline's house. A tall man with greasy hair and a permanent scowl. He spoke with the confidence of someone who believed the town belonged to him. "That fence has been on my land since I bought the place," he claimed. Lydia raised an eyebrow. "The fence was built 30 years ago." "Exactly," he said smugly. "It's time it came down." She showed him the land survey. He laughed. "I know the judge. I'll win this." And that's when Lydia realized this wasn't just about a fence. It was about something deeper, something colder. The next morning, she called a few old friends. A former student, now a Supreme Court clerk. A former colleague, now a federal judge. She told them she was going to Asheville's court. They wished her luck. They didn't know how badly she'd need it. The courtroom on the day of a hearing was old and dim. Paint peeled from the high ceiling. A dusty American flag leaned against the wall. The gallery was nearly full. News traveled fast in small towns, especially when trouble was brewing. Lydia wore a simple gray suit. She didn't bring a lawyer. She didn't think she'd need one. She underestimated the power of small-town arrogance. And that's when Judge Mallory made his move. That's when he banged the gavel. That's when he fined her $10,000. That's when he crossed a line he'd never be able to uncross. Because just as he was about to call the next case, the courtroom doors opened again, and in walked someone no one expected. The doors creaked loudly as they swung open, drawing every eye in the courtroom. A tall black man in a dark suit stepped in, his face unreadable behind thin-rimmed glasses. Behind him, a younger woman followed, holding a briefcase, her heels clicking confidently on the polished floor. Judge Mallory blinked. "Excuse me, who are—" "Your Honor," the man interrupted calmly, walking straight to the front. "My name is Martin Ellis, senior legal counsel at the Department of Justice." The room broke into whispers. "And I'm here in official capacity, representing Professor Lydia Carrington." Lydia didn't turn around. She simply gave the smallest smile. Judge Mallory's lips tightened. She didn't file for representation. She's already been fined for contempt of court. The younger woman opened the briefcase. "We have authorization to intervene under Section 242 of Title 18, she said, placing a document on the clerk's desk. "Violation of constitutional rights under color of law. This case is now under federal review." The judge's face went pale. Lydia turned slowly, her voice calm as ever. "I tried to tell you, Your Honor. You assumed I was just an old woman. But you made a mistake. A big one." The courtroom was dead silent now. Carl Dobbins, still sitting behind his lawyer, looked like someone had yanked the ground from beneath him. "Court is in recess," Judge Mallory said quickly, his voice cracking. But the DOJ lawyer wasn't done. "No, Your Honor, you don't get to run from this. This court's actions are now under investigation, and until further notice, all decisions made in this case are suspended." The judge slammed his gavel, not in control, but trying to feel like he was. "We're done here," he snapped. "No," said Lydia, still standing. "We're just getting started." 10 days earlier, Lydia had stood on the back porch of her sister's house, looking out at the yard. The old fence, painted white, was chipped and leaning in spots. A swing set rusted in the corner. Caroline never had children, but she loved having the neighborhood kids over. Lydia touched the wood, running her fingers along the edge. She could still smell the sweet tea Caroline always made in the summers. The hydrangeas still bloomed along the edge of the garden. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. She had come to say goodbye, to settle her sister's affairs quietly. But Carl Dobbins had other plans. When he came storming up the driveway with a printed photo and a measuring tape, Lydia didn't take him seriously. Not at first. "You're trespassing," she told him. "I'm defending my property," he replied. "You're 2 feet off. That fence is right where it should be." "Not according to this," he said, waving the old photo. "That's not a survey. That's a picture, with no date." Carl's tone turned sharp. "I've lived in this town all my life, lady. I know what belongs to me." She raised an eyebrow. "That's not how property law works." He smirked. "We'll see what Judge Mallory thinks." The way he said the judge's name made her stomach twist. Lydia had heard of Conrad Mallory, a man who ruled his courtroom like a king, known for throwing people in jail for talking too much, as if speech itself was a crime. And he didn't take kindly to being challenged, especially not by women, and certainly not by someone who looked like Lydia. She made a few calls that night. Her goddaughter, Tessa, was a rising legal analyst at the DOJ. Tessa had always admired her Aunt Lydia and had even visited Caroline's house as a child. When Lydia explained what was happening, Tessa didn't hesitate. "Send me everything. All the documents. The survey. Any letters. I'll get Martin involved." "Martin Ellis?" Lydia asked. "Yep. He owes you anyway. You got him his first job." Lydia chuckled. "True." And so, while Asheville slept, wheels began to turn behind the scenes. Lydia didn't need to raise her voice or stomp her feet. She let the law speak for her. But that didn't mean she wasn't angry. Angry not just for herself, but for every other person who'd stood in that courtroom without a voice. For every elderly person talked down to every person fined unfairly. Every time power had been used not for justice, but to punish. When the court day came, she dressed simply and walked in alone. She had wanted to give Mallory a chance to do the right thing. Instead, he tried to humiliate her. Instead, he tried to crush her. Now, the tables were turning. The courthouse buzzed like a kicked beehive. The news spread fast. Professor Carrington was a Harvard law expert, and the DOJ was now involved. Reporters gathered outside. Half the town came to the next hearing, trying to squeeze into the gallery. But Judge Mallory delayed. He asked for a week to review materials. The DOJ didn't object, but made it clear they were watching closely. Every delay, every word, every expression would be recorded. Lydia used that week wisely. She met with the town's mayor, with a few elders from her old church, with the local NAACP chapter. She even visited the high school to speak to a class of students about justice and power. "Never let anyone tell you your voice doesn't matter," she told them. "Even if it shakes when you speak anyway." The students clapped. Some even cried. But while Lydia inspired, Judge Mallory fumed. He wasn't used to being challenged. He wasn't used to cameras outside his courtroom or people whispering when he walked by, and he certainly wasn't used to having his authority questioned by a woman who didn't flinch under pressure. Then came the letter. It arrived by courier, official seal, DOJ header, addressed to Judge Conrad Mallory. Inside, a formal notice. Pending investigation, you are required to recuse yourself from all cases involving Professor Lydia Carrington. Failure to do so may result in federal disciplinary action. That night, Mallory didn't sleep. He sat in his study, surrounded by old books and law journals, none of which could save him now. He picked up the phone and made a call to Carl Dobbins. "We've got a problem," he muttered. But Carl had problems of his own, because while Mallory was losing control in the courtroom, Carl was losing support in the town. People started talking about the time he underpaid a worker and blamed it on bad math, about the black family he tried to evict 10 years ago for a noise complaint that turned out to be nothing, about the fact that Caroline Carrington had always kept her fence in perfect order, and that Carl never once complained until she died. Asheville wasn't perfect, but it remembered, and it didn't like bullies. One day before the next hearing, Lydia went for a walk. She passed her old school, the park where she used to read under the big oak tree, and the corner store that still sold candy for 10 cents. And then she stopped. Standing on the courthouse steps was a small group of protesters, mostly young, a few elders. They held signs. Justice is not loud, it's clear. Protect our elders. We stand with Professor Carrington. Lydia smiled. Then someone tapped her shoulder. She turned and saw her old high school principal, Mr. Hughes. He must have been 90 now, but still stood tall. He took off his hat and said, "You were always going to change the world. I'm proud of you, Lydia." She wiped a tear from her cheek. But just as she turned to thank him, a loud shout rang out from the edge of the crowd. It came from a red truck pulling up fast to the courthouse curb. The engine roared. A man jumped out. It was Carl Dobbins, his face red, his hand shaking, and he was holding something in his hand, something black, something shiny. The crowd screamed. Lydia froze, and everything stopped. For a split second, the world seemed to hold its breath. The black object in Carl Dobbins' hand gleamed under the morning sun. He clutched it high, wild-eyed, his voice rising above the chaos. "Y'all think you can ruin my life? Over fence, over lies." People screamed and ducked behind cars. One woman dropped her phone. The younger protesters ran, grabbing elders by the arms, pulling them to safety. Someone shouted, "He's got a gun!" But it wasn't a gun. It was a crowbar. But in that charged moment, no one could tell. Carl stormed toward the courthouse steps, waving it above his head like a madman. Lydia didn't move. She stood in place, her gray coat fluttering slightly in the wind, her face calm, her spine straight as a flagpole. "Carl!" a voice shouted. It was the sheriff, bursting from the front doors, hand on his holster. He shouted again, "Put it down! Now!" Carl ignored him. His face was twisted in rage. "They're turning this town against me. That house, those women, they've always thought they were better than the rest of us." He was 2 steps away from Lydia now. Then came the sound. Click. The sheriff had drawn his weapon, aimed straight at Carl. "Drop it," he barked. Carl froze. For the first time, he saw Lydia's face. Not afraid, not even angry, just disappointed. "You're better than this," she said softly. Carl looked confused. His hand trembled. His fingers loosened. The crowbar clattered to the stone steps. The sheriff rushed forward, grabbing Carl by the shoulders, forcing him to the ground. Handcuffs snapped closed with a cold finality. Sirens were already screaming down the street. Within minutes, local police, media, and federal marshals filled the area. Carl Dobbins was hauled away, his face now pale and lost. Lydia finally sat down on the bench nearby. A protester brought her a bottle of water. Another held her hand. "I'm fine," she assured them, her voice steady. But deep down she knew this wasn't just about Carl anymore. Something far bigger had been awakened. By the next morning, the incident was national news. Local land dispute turns explosive as DOJ steps in. Harvard law professor targeted in small-town courtroom clash. Is Asheville hiding a pattern of judicial abuse? Reporters lined the courthouse steps. The mayor of Asheville called an emergency town hall. The judge, Conrad Mallory, remained silent. No public statements. No court hearings. No comment. Inside the courthouse, a quiet storm was brewing. The DOJ team now had full access to records from Judge Mallory's past cases. They combed through years of rulings, patterns of unusually high fines of minority defendants, dismissals of clear evidence, and an overwhelming number of contempt charges aimed at women. Martin Ellis, seated in a temporary office at Town Hall, reviewed case after case. "Tessa," he said, passing her a file. "This one right here. Look familiar?" She nodded grimly. "Same as Lydia's. Property dispute. Black homeowner. Fined $5,000. And look at the lawyer on the other side," Martin added. "Carl Dobbins' cousin." Tessa exhaled sharply. "This is corruption. Plain and simple." They shared a glance. The kind that meant war was coming. Meanwhile, Lydia stayed at her sister's house. The nights were quieter now, but not in a peaceful way. In a heavy way, like the air was waiting for something. She sat on the porch most evenings, sipping tea, sorting through Caroline's journals. Her sister had documented everything: neighbors, garden plans, stories about their childhood. One night, Lydia found an entry from 3 years ago. "Carl's been sniffing around again. Keeps asking about that side of the fence. I told him it's been like that for years. He didn't like that answer. I think he's planning something." Lydia closed the journal slowly. Her sister had seen it coming, but no one listened. The next morning, the doorbell rang. It was Tessa. She hugged Lydia tightly. "We've got him," she said. "Not just Carl. The judge, too." Lydia raised an eyebrow. "Go on." Tessa handed her a thick manila folder. "There's evidence Mallory and Carl had a deal. Old letters, property handoffs, payoffs. This goes way beyond your case." Lydia scanned the documents. Her mind sharpened like a blade. "They've stolen homes from people," she whispered, "buried it under legalese, and no one ever looked close enough." "Until now," Tessa said. They spent the day planning. A public hearing was scheduled. DOJ investigators were preparing to question Mallory. And Lydia? She was ready to speak. She knew her words would matter, but she didn't expect what would come next. The hearing room was packed. DOJ officials sat on one side, local leaders on the other. Cameras rolled. Reporters whispered. Outside, protesters gathered again, this time with more signs, more people, more voices. Judge Mallory was called to front. He walked slowly, like a man carrying bricks in his pockets. He sat down, adjusted his glasses, his face hard as stone. Lydia was called next. She rose from her seat, walking slowly but confidently to the center. She wore her gray coat, her glasses perched perfectly. She looked every bit the professor, the elder, the symbol of something bigger. She began calmly. "I was born in Asheville, in this very courthouse. My mother once mopped the floors while judges passed sentence on men who looked like my father." Gasps rippled through the room. She continued, "I left this town to become a lawyer, a teacher, a servant of the Constitution. But when I returned, I was not greeted as a citizen. I was dismissed, fined, silenced." Her voice didn't shake. "But I am not the first. I am only the one who had the power to speak loud enough. How many others have sat in that courtroom and been told they don't matter?" Now the room was silent. Mallory shifted in his seat. "I do not speak today for revenge," she said. "I speak for justice. Not just for me, but for every person who didn't have a Tessa, who didn't have a Martin, who didn't have a voice." She turned and looked Mallory in the eye. "You may have worn the robe, but you forgot what it stands for." Then she sat down. The room erupted in applause. Mallory didn't look up. The DOJ official stood next. Based on the findings, he announced, "We are recommending formal charges against Judge Conrad Mallory for abuse of power, conspiracy to defraud property owners, and obstruction of justice." The crowd gasped again. Mallory stood slowly. "I want to speak," he said, his voice gravelly. The officials exchanged a glance. "Proceed," they said. Mallory looked around the room. Then, for the first time in his career, he apologized. "I lost my way," he admitted. "Power became something I used, not something I served. And I am sorry." A few people looked stunned. But Lydia? She didn't nod, didn't smile. She just watched, silently, because forgiveness is earned, not begged for. The hearing closed with formal proceedings to remove Judge Mallory from the bench. Carl Dobbins was already facing charges, and Asheville was beginning to change. But just as Lydia returned home that night, just as she locked the front door and set her purse down. Her phone rang. She answered. A voice on the other end whispered, "You don't know the half of it," and then hung up. Lydia stared at the phone in her hand. The voice was unfamiliar, deep, calm, and unsettling. Just 6 words, spoken like a riddle dropped into her lap. "You don't know the half of it." She sat motionless for a few moments, then slowly placed the phone on the table beside her. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The quiet around her house now felt like it was hiding something, like the silence had secrets. She stood, pulled the curtains close, and checked that every door was locked. Then she picked up the phone again and dialed Tessa. It rang twice. "Aunt Lydia?" Tessa answered. "I just got a call," Lydia said calmly. "Someone said, I don't know the half of it." Then they hung up. Tessa was silent for a second. Then, "Did they say anything else? Any name, anything?" "No, just that." Then click. "I'll trace the number," Tessa replied quickly, "and I'll call Martin. He needs to know this." Lydia nodded. "Do it. Something tells me this runs deeper than Mallory and Dobbins." She hung up, walked to the fireplace, and threw another log onto the fire. If someone thought they could scare her off now, they'd chosen the wrong woman. The next morning, the sky over Asheville was a clear blue. The courthouse remained quiet, with Judge Mallory suspended and the city preparing for a full judicial review. The mayor released a statement promising reform. New officials were being vetted to fill the vacant seat on the bench. Some citizens were hopeful, but something darker was brewing beneath the surface. Martin Ellis sat in his rented office near City Hall, tapping his pen against his notebook as Tessa explained the phone call. He frowned. "A warning, or a threat," Tessa said. Martin leaned forward. "What if they're right? What if Mallory was just a piece of something bigger?" "You think there are more like him?" she asked. Martin opened a folder on the desk. "I think there's something we missed. Look here. This is a case from 15 years ago. A single mother evicted from her property. She claimed her documents disappeared overnight. The judge? Mallory. The plaintiff? Not Dobbins, but a company called Southland Holdings." Tessa narrowed her eyes. "Never heard of it." "Exactly," Martin said. "Because it's not real. It was a shell company. Registered to a P.O. box. No employees. No office. Fake companies used to steal property?" Martin nodded. "And that's not the only one. I found 6 more." They stared at each other. Then Tessa whispered, "This is a land grab operation." Martin picked up the phone. "We need Lydia." Lydia met them an hour later at the small law office turned investigation center. Martin laid out the documents across the long wooden table, each case a link in the chain. "Some of these people are gone now," he explained. "Others just left town. No one ever questioned it. The judge ruled they moved on. And it always happened in certain neighborhoods," Tessa added. "Mostly black families, elderly homeowners, people without lawyers." Lydia's jaw tightened. "They picked the ones least likely to fight back." "Until you showed up," Martin said. Lydia studied the names on the pages. "I recognize this one," she said, tapping a photo. "Evelyn James. She went to church with my sister. She lost her house a few years ago. Claimed it was a clerical mistake." Martin nodded. "She was forced out. We found documents showing forged signatures on the transfer forms. The judge signed off without ever seeing her." Lydia stood slowly. "I need to talk to her." Evelyn James lived in a small apartment above a hardware store on the edge of town. She was 83, nearly blind in one eye, and walked with a cane. When she opened the door and saw Lydia, she gasped. "Lydia Carrington? Lord have mercy, it's been years." They hugged, warm and long. Evelyn invited her in, offered sweet tea, and they sat by the window as the afternoon sun streamed in. "I heard what happened to you," Evelyn said, her voice raspy. "About that fool judge and that Dobbins man. Caroline always said they were trouble." Lydia leaned forward. "Evelyn, I need to ask you something. About your house. The one you lost." Evelyn sighed deeply. "That old place. Lived there 40 years. Paid it off with my own 2 hands. One day, a letter came in the mail. Said there was a lien. I never missed a payment, but they said I owed $5,000. Took it to court. Mallory said it was final. Said I could appeal if I had a lawyer, but... She paused. I couldn't afford one. Lydia's voice was soft. Did you ever find out who bought your house? Some company out of town. South something. Never met them. They sent a letter. Said I had 30 days to leave. Lydia squeezed her hand. You were robbed, Evelyn. Tears welled in the older woman's eyes. I knew it. I just didn't know how to prove it. Lydia stood, gently kissed Evelyn's forehead, and said, We're going to prove it now. Back at the office, Tessa had tracked down something huge. Martin, she said, sliding a folder across the desk. Southland Holdings isn't just a fake company. It's part of a network. We found connections to a law firm in Atlanta. That firm has ties to land development groups. They buy up properties for cheap, flip them for 10 times the value. Martin flipped through the documents. And guess who signed several of the transfers? Don't say it, Tessa whispered. Martin said it. Judge Mallory. They looked up as Lydia entered, her face hard. We have to go public, she said. Now. Martin hesitated. That'll put targets on all our backs. I already have one, Lydia said. I've had it since I stepped foot in that courtroom. I'm not hiding anymore. They agreed to organize a press conference. But before they could finalize the plans, something else happened. Something they weren't ready for. Late that night, a fire broke out. The Carrington house. Lydia's sister's home. The fire department responded quickly, but the back half of the house was gone by the time they arrived. Lydia arrived in her night clothes, standing in the middle of the street as the flames were finally put out. The officer on duty approached gently. Looks like someone broke in, he said quietly. We found a gasket near the back porch. We think it was arson. Tessa and Martin arrived minutes later. Lydia didn't cry. She just stared at the burned wood, the blackened fence line, the charred hydrangeas her sister had planted years ago. She whispered, They're getting desperate. Martin put a hand on her shoulder. That means we're close. But Lydia knew something else. They hadn't just burned her house. They'd tried to erase her sister. And that meant this was no longer just a legal battle. This was personal. Ashes still smoked from the remains of the Carrington house as dawn painted the sky in streaks of orange and purple. Fire crews had left hours ago, leaving behind yellow tape, a few scorched trees, and the bitter smell of burnt wood. Lydia stood in the yard where the back porch used to be, wearing a long coat over her nightgown. She clutched a small, charred book, the only thing the firefighters had managed to save from her sister's study. It was Caroline's prayer journal. The edges were blackened, the pages warped and flaking, but the first entry was still readable. Lord, help me protect what's mine. Give me the strength to stand firm, even when I stand alone. Lydia closed the book, pressing it gently to her chest. She wasn't alone anymore. Not now. The press conference was held on the courthouse steps, just 1 week after the fire. The crowd was larger than anyone expected. Protesters, reporters, townspeople. Some who had stayed silent for years now stood shoulder to shoulder in the crisp morning air. Some held signs. Others just stood with their arms crossed, eyes locked on the microphone stand like it was a pulpit. Lydia stepped up to the mic, flanked by Martin and Tessa. Good morning, she began, her voice echoing across the square. Last week, I was fined $10,000 for contempt of court. But the truth is, what I said wasn't contempt. It was truth, and the truth offended a man who'd spent years using the law to silence others. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Lydia continued, Judge Conrad Mallory is not the only problem. He is one thread in a larger web, a web that has trapped black families, elderly residents, and anyone too poor to fight back. Through fake companies, forged documents, and quiet deals, they have stolen land and destroyed lives. Gasps. Camera shutters clicked like a drumline. Martin stepped forward next, presenting copies of the evidence. Property records, fake signatures, old court rulings. These are not just accusations. This is proof. We're calling for a full federal investigation into all cases handled by Judge Mallory in the last 20 years. Tessa followed with a final blow, and we have reason to believe the recent fire at the Carrington property was intentional, an act of retaliation. We're working with federal agents to find out who's responsible, and we will find them. Lydia returned to the mic, and to whoever called me that night and said, "Asterisk, you don't know the half of it. I know enough now, but I'm ready to learn the rest, and I'm not afraid." Applause erupted, but someone in the crowd didn't clap. A man in a gray hoodie stood in the back. He didn't hold a phone, didn't chant, just stared. Lydia noticed him. He noticed her back, and then he turned and walked away. She made a mental note of his face. Something about him didn't feel like a protester. Something about him felt like the next clue. Later that afternoon, Lydia met with 2 federal marshals assigned to her case. They confirmed what she feared. The fire was no accident. A second gas can was found in the bushes. A trail of footprints, large boot prints, led away from the back door through the yard and vanished near the road. Whoever did it knew the house, one marshal said. They knew where to start the fire and how to make it spread quickly. They wanted it to burn from the inside out. Lydia felt sick. Tessa gripped her hand. Martin asked a question they were all thinking. What were they trying to hide? The answer came hours later. One of the firefighters had found a piece of melted plastic near the foundation. It was a flash drive, warped, barely intact, but the department techs managed to extract a few files. And what they found sent a chill through the room. Video footage, grainy, time-stamped recordings, hidden camera angles, people signing documents in what looked like Judge Mallory's chambers, but not during official hearings. No stenographer, no flags, just quick, quiet deals. In one video, Carl Dobbins is seen handing over a thick envelope. In another, Mallory signs a property deed, then hands it to a man in a suit. No names, no sound, but the images spoke volumes. Lydia leaned forward. That room is not the courtroom. It's his office. Martin nodded slowly. This wasn't just about rulings. This was organized theft. And then Tessa pointed at the screen. "Pause that," she said. Martin froze the frame. In the corner of the room, barely visible in the grainy footage, stood the man in the gray hoodie. No face, but the stance, the size, it was him, the one from the press conference. "Who is he?" Tessa whispered. Martin stood. "That's what we need to find out next." That night, Lydia stayed in a hotel on the other side of town. Her sister's house was now a blackened shell, taped off, a crime scene. But something in her heart still reached for it. Like Caroline was still there, whispering from the ashes. She sat by the hotel window, watching the streetlights flicker. Then she saw him again. The man in the hoodie, standing across the street, watching. She stood slowly, phone in hand, ready to call the marshals. But something in her gut said wait. He didn't move. He just nodded, then turned the corner and disappeared. Lydia put the phone down. "I'll find you," she said quietly. "Whatever you know, I'll find it." The next day brought more tremors. A whistleblower came forward, an old court clerk who used to work under Judge Mallory. His name was Curtis Dunham. He had retired 5 years earlier and had been living in Atlanta, trying to forget what he'd seen. But now, with the town rising, with the truth surfacing, he couldn't stay silent. He sat down with Lydia, Martin, and Tessa in a quiet diner off Route 6. "I saw the first dirty deal back in '04, he confessed. Mallory approved the foreclosure, without notice. The guy never even got a letter. They paid me to backdate the paperwork. I didn't know what I was doing at first. I was scared. Then it became normal." He shook his head. "I tried to quit. They said if I talked, I'd end up in a ditch. I believed them." Martin leaned forward. "Do you know who they are?" "All of them." Curtis nodded. "Mallory, Dobbins, a few others. Lawyers, one of the bank managers, maybe a county assessor, or 2. It was a whole system." "And the man in the hoodie?" Lydia asked. "You ever see him?" Curtis looked up sharply. "Yeah, he was a runner. Courier. He delivered the envelopes. Picked up payments. Never talked. Never gave a name. Tessa frowned. He's still watching us. Curtis leaned in. Then be careful. That man isn't just muscle. He's a fixer. If he's around, something big is coming. That night, Martin got a call from a restricted number. He answered. A voice, cold and gravelly, spoke one sentence. Tell the professor to back off. Last warning. Then silence. Martin called Lydia immediately. But by the time she picked up, something else had happened. Tessa, who had gone out to pick up dinner, was missing. Her car was found on the side of the road. Driver's door wide open. Phone on the seat. Key still in ignition. But no sign of Tessa. Lydia dropped the phone. The world spun. This had gone beyond courtroom corruption. They had just made it personal. Again, Lydia stared at the empty parking spot where Tessa's car had been found. The wind whipped her coat around her legs, but she barely noticed. The engine was still warm when the police got there. The driver's door wide open. The phone on the seat had one unsent text. Aunt Lydia, I think someone's. That was it. Unfinished. Unsent. Gone. The night air felt colder than usual. Too still. Too quiet. Federal marshals surrounded the scene. Flashlights combing the roadside and the wooded area just beyond. Martin arrived moments later, breathless, tie loosened, panic in his eyes. Where is she? He asked Lydia, his voice tight. They don't know, Lydia replied, her voice low, holding her composure like a fragile vase ready to crack. They think someone took her. Kidnapped? Martin asked, his voice rising. They won't say the word, but yes. The lead marshal approached. We're treating this as a possible abduction. No ransom demand yet. No witnesses. We've sent an alert to every precinct in the state. Lydia's hand curled into a fist. Whoever did this, she said, has crossed a line they won't come back from. The town of Asheville was shaken once again. People who'd stood on the courthouse steps now whispered in the market aisles. They sent prayers. They asked questions. But some simply stayed indoors, curtains drawn, afraid the battle was bigger than they realized. Because it was. By now, the Department of Justice had linked more than 40 properties, all taken under suspicious rulings from Judge Mallory. Many of the victims were now homeless or living in other counties, too poor to fight, too tired to speak. But Lydia's voice only grew louder. She held another press conference. She showed Tessa's photo. She stared into the cameras and said, She is not a casualty. She is not leverage. She is family, and I will bring her home. Then she looked straight into the lens and added, To the one in the hoodie, I know you're watching. Bring her back, or I will tear your entire operation apart piece by piece. The next morning, an envelope was slid under the door of the motel where Lydia now stayed. No address, no markings. Inside was a flash drive and a handwritten note. She's alive. Don't go to the police. One name, Waylon Briggs. Martin ran a search. Waylon Briggs was a name that hadn't come up before. No public ties to the courthouse. No real estate licenses. No local business. But then they found an arrest from 12 years ago. Trespassing. Assault. Case dismissed. And the judge? Mallory. Briggs hadn't gone to jail. He'd vanished from public records for a decade. Until now. Martin dug deeper, pulling old tax records, voter rolls, anything with a trace of the name. Finally, they hit something. An old warehouse lease, 5 miles outside of Asheville, in Waylon Briggs' name. The property was listed as storage and transport, but no registered vehicles, no shipping manifests. Just silence. Lydia stared at the address. That's where she is, she said. The marshals were cautious. We'll get a team together. Might take a few hours. Lydia shook her head. She doesn't have hours. They drove out in an unmarked SUV. Lydia, Martin, and 2 marshals, flashlights ready, vests under their coats, tension thick in the air. The warehouse stood near the tree line, rusted metal walls, one flickering floodlight above the front door. A chain-link fence surrounded the lot. The gate was open. Too open. Martin slowed the vehicle. Trap. Doesn't matter, Lydia said. We go. They stepped out, approaching the door slowly. No sounds, no lights inside. One of the marshals checked the handle. Unlocked. He pushed it open. Inside was darkness, musty and cold. Dust in the air. Rows of empty crates lined the walls. And then they heard it, a faint cough, followed by a voice weak but clear. "Aunt Lydia?" Lydia rushed forward. Tessa was tied to a chair in the far corner. No gag, no bruises, just wide, terrified eyes and raw wrists. The marshals moved quickly, sweeping the room, checking for threats. Nothing. Martin cut the rope, helped Tessa to her feet. Lydia wrapped her in a tight hug. "I'm okay," Tessa whispered. "I'm okay." Then she added, "But I heard everything. There's more, so much more." They didn't wait. They rushed her to a secure location, where she gave her statement under protective custody. And what she told them blew the case wide open. Tessa's voice trembled at first as she spoke to the agents. "They took me at the gas station. Just as I got back in the car, someone opened the door and pulled me out. They blindfolded me. Didn't hurt me, but they warned me." "Warned you about what?" Martin asked. "About Lydia, about pushing too far. They said they weren't afraid of her, yet, but they would be if she kept digging." "Did they say who they were?" Lydia asked. "No, but I heard names. In the warehouse. I don't think they realized I could hear. One of them said, 'Briggs is losing control.' Another said, 'What if the judge flips?'" Martin leaned forward. "The judge. Mallory." Tessa nodded. "They're afraid he'll turn state's evidence." Lydia sat back in her chair, eyes narrowing. "He knows everything. If he talks." Martin finished her sentence. "He brings the whole thing down." But Lydia had another thought, one that sent a chill through her. What if they try to silence him before he can? That night, Judge Mallory was under house arrest, guarded by local deputies, pending the federal trial. But when Lydia, Martin, and two marshals arrived to warn him, the front door was open. Lights off. One deputy was unconscious on the porch. The other? Nowhere to be seen. Martin drew his weapon. The marshals moved in first, sweeping the rooms. Kitchen, clear. Living room, clear. Study, empty. Bedroom. One of the marshals raised his voice. Clear. Then paused. On the wall behind the bed, written in something red. He stayed silent. "Be wise." But no sign of Mallory. He was gone. Lydia stood in the doorway, staring at the words, the red paint dripping down the wall. "They've got him," she said. "And if he dies," Martin said, voice grim, "we lose our key witness." Tessa, now safe and recovering, watched from behind. "They've taken a judge," she whispered, "and they think they can keep getting away with it." Lydia turned slowly. "They think this is fear." She clenched her fist. But what they've really done is guarantee their downfall. Because the truth wasn't just coming. It was already here. And she wasn't done. Not even close. The sun hadn't risen yet, but Lydia was wide awake, sitting in the war room, what the DOJ had nicknamed their temporary office. A map of Asheville covered the wall, red pins marking every stolen property, yellow ones for known associates, and now a black pin. The judge was missing. That changed everything. Martin, pacing near the coffee machine, muttered he was under guard, inside his home. 2 deputies, one of them trained. How does someone disappear under watch? Tessa, still pale from her abduction but sharp-eyed and alert, answered from the corner. They weren't guarding him. They were watching him. Whoever took him had help from the inside. The word sat heavy in the air. It meant the corruption didn't stop at Judge Mallory. It stretched into the veins of law enforcement, maybe deeper. And now, with Mallory missing, the cartel of land theft, this invisible empire hiding in plain sight, had removed the one person who could name every player. But Lydia had one weapon left. A name, Waylon Briggs. And she planned to use it. Later that morning, Martin returned from a call with a federal contact. "We found Briggs," he said, "or at least where he was last seen. A private hunting lodge outside Lake Harrow. No power, no signal, no neighbors for miles. Lydia didn't hesitate. We go there. Today. We can't just storm the place, Tessa cautioned. We need a warrant. And the DOJ wants to move carefully now. Too many eyes on this case after fire. Then let them watch, Lydia snapped. They've watched long enough while people lost everything. Martin nodded. I'll prep a team. No, Lydia said, eyes burning. We go. Quietly. Just us and someone we trust. Martin raised a brow. Are you serious? As serious as the flames that ate my sister's house. By noon, Lydia, Martin, Tessa, and a single marshal, Agent Brower, drove through the winding woods toward Lake Harrow. Lydia rode in silence, staring out the window, remembering summer trips with Caroline. The woods had been a place of peace once. Now, it felt like they were driving into the heart of the rot. The hunting lodge was tucked behind a long gravel path, flanked by dead trees and tall brush. No vehicles outside. No signs of life. Brower parked half a mile away. They approached on foot. The lodge was 2 stories, made of faded cedar planks and old stone. The windows were covered with plywood. The front door locked from the inside. But it wasn't empty. Tessa froze first, pointing. There, top window. Someone's moving. Brower whispered, I'll go around. Cover the back. Martin pulled Lydia close. This could be dangerous. You should stay behind. She gave him a look that could melt iron. I didn't come this far to wait in the bushes. They crept closer. Then from inside, a crash. Glass shattering. A loud, muffled shout. Then silence. Brower's voice crackled over the radio. I'm in. Found the judge. They ran to the back, where the door now hung open. Inside, Judge Mallory sat on the floor, bound at the wrist, blood on his temple, his eyes dazed. He's alive, Brower confirmed, but he's been beaten. Drugged, maybe. Lydia knelt beside him. Mallory blinked slowly. You came? Lydia's voice was steady. We need names, Conrad. Everything. Right now. He coughed, voice barely a whisper. It's not just Asheville. This is happening in other counties. They called it the clean sweep. Take property. Flip it. Use the courts like weapons. Briggs wasn't even the top. Just a handler. Who's above him? Martin asked. Mallory's eyelids drooped. A name. William. Faulkner. Lawyer. Consultant. Lobby for developers. He's the one who gave me the list. What list? Lydia pressed. Mallory shook his head weakly. Before he could answer, a gunshot rang out. The bullet struck the window frame inches from Brower's head. Down! The marshal yelled, drawing his weapon. Tessa ducked. Martin shielded Lydia. Outside, footsteps thundered. Tires squealed. A black SUV peeled away down the gravel path. Brower gave chase but didn't fire. Too many trees, too much risk. By the time they reached the road, the vehicle was gone, but Mallory was alive, and they had a new name, William Faulkner. Back in town, Lydia made calls to contacts she hadn't spoken to in decades, former students, judges, even a few retired FBI analysts. William Faulkner wasn't just any consultant. He was an architect, a corporate lawyer-turned-political kingmaker who moved silently between development firms and county boards. He sold cities visions of progress, while secretly controlling networks of fake shell companies used to absorb land through foreclosures, tax liens, or legal trickery. He operated behind curtains, speaking through proxies, and he had been targeting towns like Asheville for years. Now they had enough to go public, really public, national media, Senate-level exposure. But Lydia wasn't just thinking about justice anymore. She was thinking about Caroline, about the garden she loved, the swing set she refused to throw away, the way she always said, we don't run, we rise. So Lydia prepared a bombshell, not just a press release, a public town trial, one that wouldn't wait for bureaucrats. They would put the truth on full display. Names, faces, documents. And if William Faulkner wanted to keep hiding, she'd drag him into the light herself. The town meeting was scheduled for Saturday. Word spread fast. Flyers posted. Social media exploded. The Asheville Justice Assembly was born, a movement now much bigger than one professor, one judge, or even one town. But as the town prepared for truth, Faulkner made his move. The night before the meeting, a letter was slipped under Lydia's hotel room door. No envelope, just a message. You hold the match. We hold the gas. Cancel the meeting, or watch it all burn again. Lydia handed the letter to Martin without blinking. Let them burn it, she said. The truth doesn't die in fire. Martin nodded, but the fear in his eyes wasn't for her. It was for what they'd try next. Because when people like Faulkner lose control, they stop sending warnings and start sending bodies. Asheville was electric. The town hall hadn't seen this much foot traffic in decades. People poured in by the dozens, young, old, black, white, rich, poor, drawn by whispers of something seismic. The air crackled with tension and hope. Lydia stood behind the curtain of the small makeshift stage set at the front of the hall. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the moment. She clutched Caroline's charred prayer journal in one hand and a folder of damning documents in the other. Tessa stood beside her, recovered but watchful. Martin paced in the corner, his phone to his ear, coordinating last-minute security with federal marshals now stationed around the perimeter. After the anonymous threat left at the hotel, every corner of this building was swept. Twice. Still, Lydia could feel it. They were out there, watching, waiting. But tonight, Lydia wasn't backing down. Tonight, the people of Asheville were going to see the truth, raw, undeniable, and louder than fear. She stepped onto the stage. The hall erupted in applause. She didn't smile. She opened her folder, cleared her throat, and began. Good evening. My name is Professor Lydia Carrington. Some of you knew my sister, Caroline. Some of you remember me as the quiet girl who left this town 60 years ago. She looked over the crowd. I came back to bury my sister. I did not expect to dig up a system that has buried the rights of this town's people for years. Silence fell like snow. She held up a document. This is a property deed, one of many, signed illegally, approved by a judge under the table, taken from a woman who had no lawyer, no warning, and no help. She held up another. This one, stolen from a disabled veteran. The ruling was filed 2 days before the court date. Gasps. Lydia went on. Judge Conrad Mallory was not a lone wolf. He was part of an organized effort to strip land from working-class people and feed it to the highest bidder. That effort has a name, one you deserve to hear. She placed the name on the projector screen. William Faulkner. Suddenly, the back door slammed open. Gasps and a few startled screams followed. Men in dark suits walked in. 3 of them. Serious. Silent. One walked straight down the aisle toward the stage. Lydia didn't flinch. She recognized him. Faulkner. Gray suit. Calm eyes. A quiet smirk playing on his lips like he already owned the room. He stopped just short of the platform. You've made quite a show, he said smoothly. But you're trespassing into federal legal territory, Professor. Lydia stepped forward. Oh, no. You're mistaking this for your courtroom. This is a people's house. And the people have questions. Faulkner looked around slowly, his smirk fading just slightly as he saw the cameras, the press, the microphones. He spoke louder. Do you really think this theater will stop progress? Asheville was dying before we helped it grow. We brought jobs. We brought development. You brought paperwork and noise. Lydia leaned closer to her mic. You didn't bring progress. You brought predation. Cheers erupted. Faulkner raised a hand, trying to calm the crowd. You're making a mistake. The law is not on your side. Martin stood from his seat, holding up a warrant. No, this is... The marshal stepped forward. You are under federal investigation for conspiracy, fraud, bribery, and racketeering. One of them said. Faulkner froze, then whispered, You won't make it to trial. And that's when the lights cut out. Darkness swallowed the hall. Screams echoed. Lydia's heart pounded. She grabbed Tessa's arm. Martin shouted, Stay calm. Stay where you are. Then the first window shattered. Gunfire. Not loud. Just one shot. Then silence again. Tessa pulled Lydia down to the ground behind the podium. People screamed and ran for the exits. The emergency lights flicked on, bathing the hall in a weak red glow. Faulkner was gone. The marshals swept the aisles. Someone shouted, "He's out the back!" Then a second shot rang out. Louder. This time, it wasn't aimed at the ceiling. A man in the back cried out and fell. Lydia clutched Tessa. "Are you hit?" "No," Tessa said breathlessly. "We need to move." Martin reached them, grabbing Lydia's arm. "Out the side door. Now!" They pushed through the chaos, ushered by agents, ducking low behind chairs, hearts thundering. Outside, sirens screamed. More agents rushed the building. The three of them reached the car parked in the alley. Doors already open. Brower was behind the wheel, eyes alert. "Where's Faulkner?" Lydia demanded. "Gone," Brower growled. They had a team waiting. Smoke bombs, distraction shots, everything. It was a full extraction. Tessa looked back toward the town hall. "He came here to show us he wasn't afraid." "No," Lydia said, eyes steely. "He came because he is." Back at their safe house, Lydia collapsed into a chair. "I had him," she whispered. "He was right there. I could have ended this." Martin sat beside her, hands clasped. "You did end it for Asheville. You showed everyone the truth." Tessa nodded. Now the feds will swarm his operations in other counties. He exposed himself tonight. That's power gone. But Lydia shook her head. This isn't over. She opened her laptop. Faulkner ran because he knows what's coming next. He didn't build this alone. There's still more. The man in the hoodie. The shell companies. The corrupt officials who kept their hands clean. She pulled up a file. The one they recovered from Judge Mallory's private documents. A list. Names. 15 of them. Lawyers. Developers. Bankers. Judges. Across 5 states. "This is bigger than we thought," Lydia said. Asheville was the first domino. But now, the whole chain starts to fall. And then her phone buzzed. A blocked number. She answered. The voice on the line was familiar, ragged, frantic. "Judge Mallory. You need to listen to me," he gasped. Faulkner wasn't the top. Lydia froze. "What?" He answered to someone else. Someone none of us ever met. Codename Gideon. Only communicated through one person, the runner. Lydia's blood ran cold. The man in the hoodie. "He's real," she asked. "He's the one who set it all in motion," Mallory whispered. "I thought he worked for me. I was wrong." Then the call cut. Tessa looked at Lydia. "Gideon?" Lydia whispered the name again. The final boss. The ghost behind the curtain. The one who hadn't shown their face. Yet, the chase had just escalated. And now, she was hunting Gideon. The word Gideon echoed through Lydia's mind like a church bell in an empty valley. She stared at the blank phone screen, still glowing from the ended call, her knuckles white from gripping it. Judge Mallory had just handed her a ghost, a shadow with a name. The true puppet master. One who never stepped into courtrooms, never signed a document, never showed up on a surveillance feed. Just Gideon. Tessa was pacing behind her. This changes everything. We thought Faulkner was the top, but if Gideon's above him, if he's the real architect. Martin finished her sentence. Then Faulkner's just a frontman. Lydia stood slowly. We find Gideon. We end this. They didn't sleep that night. Instead, they pored over every document again, this time not looking for signatures or legal filings, but patterns, communications, unexplained movements, gaps in logs, names that came up twice but shouldn't have, emails that seemed automated but were too specific. And then at 3:17 a.m., Tessa found it. An internal memo buried inside the digital records Faulkner's office had been forced to surrender during the DOJ's preliminary investigation. It wasn't addressed to Faulkner. It was signed simply, G. The message was simple. Accelerate acquisitions in Asheville before audit. Reinforce silence protocols. Keep the professor under surveillance. Lydia blinked. He knew about me before I even stood in court. Tessa scrolled quickly through the metadata. It came from a private server, encrypted, but it bounced through a ghost IP in Virginia. That's defense contractor territory. Martin rubbed his temples. What if Gideon isn't just a criminal? What if he's part of something bigger, like a corporate intelligence group, or worse, former federal? The room fell silent. Then Lydia whispered, I don't care if he's a president. He touched my family. He tried to burn away our history. He doesn't get to hide. Tessa checked another file. There's more, she said. Meeting logs. Faulkner had a private suite at a high-rise in Atlanta. That's where he met with his invisible partner, always referred to as G. Multiple entries. Same days every month. Lydia grabbed her coat. Then Atlanta is where we're going next. 2 days later, they arrived in Atlanta under assumed names. Martin used an old contact from his DOJ days to get them access to the hotel's internal security systems. Tessa hacked in from the car. The building was a fortress, 62 stories tall, black glass reflecting the skyline like armor. Inside, the lobby buzzed with high-powered suits and quiet conversations. Lydia sat in the cafe, watching, waiting. Then she saw him, not Gideon, the runner. Gray hoodie, same gait, same blank stare, same eerie stillness. He entered through the east wing, hands in his pockets, and walked straight to the elevator. Tessa's voice came over the comms in Lydia's ear. He's headed up, floor 47. Private access only. That's the suite Faulkner used. Martin followed, entering the elevator seconds after. He flashed a borrowed security badge. The door slid shut. Lydia waited, heart thundering. Tessa watched the camera feeds on her laptop from the van outside. Martin's almost there. Silence. Then static. Tessa? Lydia whispered. Static again. Then Martin's voice crackled in her earpiece. He's gone. The suite's empty. Lydia stood. Gone? What do you mean gone? Martin replied, breathless. It's stripped, like no one's been here in weeks. No tech. No papers. Nothing but... He paused. Lydia, there's a wall full of photos. And your face is on it. With Caroline. With Tessa. With me. The words stabbed through her like ice. Martin continued. He's been watching us the whole time. Lydia whispered. He's not hiding from us. Tessa's voice cut in, frightened. He's toying with us. And then, suddenly, Lydia's phone buzzed again. Unknown number. She answered. A voice, deep and calm. Hello, Professor Carrington. Lydia's breath caught. Gideon. The voice chuckled softly. I always knew we'd speak. I was hoping not under such dramatic circumstances. You made a mistake, she said, every syllable sharpened by fury. You threatened my family. You tried to erase us. No, Professor, Gideon replied. I preserved what mattered. I took dead land and made it profitable. I removed rusted fences, burned out homes. That house of your sister's? It stood in the way of an innovation corridor. You call it history. I call it inefficiency. Lydia's voice was ice. You're going to rot in a cell. You're thinking too small, Gideon said. I'm not just one man. I'm a system. I'm who your country hires when it wants results without the red tape. You're a thief. I'm a solution. Then silence. A single beep. He'd hung up. Tessa screamed into comms. I traced the call. He pinged near the hotel. Just blocks away. Lydia didn't wait. She ran out of the cafe into the street, scanning the sidewalks, heart in her throat. And then she saw him. Not Gideon, but the runner again. He was crossing the street, not fast, not fleeing, just walking as if none of this mattered. Lydia gave chase. Martin shouted in her earpiece, Wait! We don't know if it's a trap. But Lydia was already running. The runner slipped into an alley. Lydia followed, breath burning in her lungs. Stop, she yelled. He paused, turned, and finally pulled down his hood. He was younger than she expected, maybe early 30s. Calm eyes, empty expression. Then he said, he's going to disappear, just like that judge. just like me. Where is he? Lydia demanded. Where's Gideon? The runner looked her straight in the eye. You're too late. And then a van screeched into the alley, doors flung open, and two masked men yanked the runner inside. The tires screamed as it sped off. Lydia stood frozen, gasping for breath. Martin and Tessa arrived seconds later, too late. Gone. Again. But not forever, because Lydia picked something up. A phone. The runner had dropped it. Still warm. Still unlocked. She looked at the home screen. One contact starred at the top. G. And beneath it, a folder marked Asheville Plan, Final Phase. She stared at the screen, then looked up at the sky. You're not disappearing, Gideon, she said. You're being dragged into the light. Back at the safe house in Atlanta, Lydia sat at the kitchen table with the runner's phone glowing in front of her like a loaded weapon. Tessa and Martin flanked her, both leaning in. The room was so quiet you could hear the soft whirring of the laptop fan nearby. No one spoke. They all knew this phone. The data on it was the missing key. Lydia tapped the folder marked Asheville Plan, Final Phase. It opened with a fingerprint scan. Blocked. Martin growled. Biometric lock. It'll take days to crack without tripping the data wipe. Tessa opened her laptop. Unless... She connected the phone to her machine, using a cord, fingers flying across the keyboard. A flurry of code flashed across the screen. Backdoor injection, she muttered. If we trick the OS into thinking we're the original user, it'll unlock just long enough to mirror the files. Martin blinked. You can do that? Not legally, she said, but we passed legal 4 chapters ago. Lydia cracked a small smile despite the tension. Minutes passed. The room was tight with pressure. Then, click, the folder opened. Inside, photos, maps, invoices, voice recordings, names, and one document titled Gideon_Protocol PDF. Lydia clicked it. Her stomach sank. The document was chilling. It outlined the entire operation. How Gideon had set up regional extraction cells to identify, target, and quietly absorb properties in low-income communities under the guise of urban renewal. Asheville had been test site 4. Test sites 1 through 3, all marked as completed. Jacksonville, Florida. Baton Rouge, Louisiana. South Fulton, Georgia. Entire communities erased and redeveloped into office parks, high-rise condos, and tech campuses. The stolen land laundered through layers of shell corporations until it was untraceable. And then, the worst part. Test Site 5, East Point, Atlanta, scheduled. Next quarter. Test Site 6, Selma, Alabama, under consideration. They weren't done. They were expanding. This isn't just corruption, Martin whispered. This is land warfare. Tessa shook her head, and they're using the law to do it. Lydia stared at the screen, her face stone. We leak it all, she said. Not to the DOJ, not to the networks, to the people. Martin raised an eyebrow. You mean? Asheville, a town hall, again, but this time live-streamed. Public, shareable, undeniable. If they want a war, we'll give them one with witnesses. Tessa nodded. I'll build the stream server. No middleman. They can't pull it down. And I'll get the word out, Martin said. This has to hit every phone in the country. Lydia stood. We're not chasing shadows anymore. Gideon wants to run his operation like a business? Fine. Let's treat him like a scandal. She glanced at the final page of the file. A photo of Gideon, blurry, taken from a reflection in a glass window. Not enough to identify him clearly, but enough to know he was real. He had a face. And soon the world would see it. 2 days later, Asheville was buzzing again. But this time, the buzz wasn't fear. It was fury. The news had spread like wildfire. A new movement had begun. What started as one woman fighting a rig fine had become a national cry against land corruption. They called it #StandForLand. People came from all over. Grassroots organizers, legal experts, news anchors, civil rights leaders. The church choir sang freedom songs again, and the streets filled with banners. We won't be moved. Homes, not hush money. From ashes to justice. At 6 p.m., the town hall filled again, overflowing this time with speakers and lights and a live feed broadcasting across the internet. Lydia took the stage. No notes, no microphone, just her voice. "You know my name by now," she began, "but this story was never just mine. This is about every person who ever lost something and was told it was their fault. It's about the land beneath our feet and the right to call it ours." She turned to the projector screen. One by one, the documents loaded. Fake deeds, forged signatures, maps of targeted zones, company names, connections to Gideon, a corporate empire built on silent evictions and violent silence. Tessa took over next. She explained how the shell companies move like snakes across state lines, how legal loopholes were used to manufacture liens out of thin air, how banks and judges alike were in on the scam. Then Martin delivered the final blow. The mirrored voice recordings. Faulkner's voice. Mallory's voice. Even Gideon's, distorted but clear. Keep it quiet. No headlines. No martyrs. She dies in fire. It's a lesson. Otherwise, they start thinking they're untouchable. The hall went silent. The video looped on a live feed. The internet exploded. Thousands of shares. Millions of views. By the time Lydia stepped off the stage, Gideon's name was trending worldwide, without anyone even knowing his real identity yet. But the mask was cracking. At midnight, Martin received a message. Encrypted. Anonymous. But not a threat. An invitation. Coordinates. A parking garage in downtown Atlanta. Lydia looked at it calmly. "It's him," she said. "He's ready to talk." Tessa frowned. "It's a trap." "I know," Lydia replied. "That's why I'm going." Martin sighed. "We go with you." "No," she said firmly. "He asked for me, and I want him to look me in the eye when this ends." The garage was empty when Lydia arrived. Dim lights flickered overhead. A single black car idled in the far corner. She walked slowly, each step echoing like a drumbeat of finality. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a man. Tall, mid-50s, polished suit, calm, chilling presence. Lydia stopped 10 feet away. "Gideon," she said. He smiled. "You came. You called. You win, Professor," he said. "You burned it all down. Now what?" "You tell the world who you are," Lydia replied. "Or I will." He tilted his head. "Do you think the system cares? One head cut off. Another grows. I'll disappear. You'll be famous. The machine will keep moving." "No," Lydia said, holding up the phone. "Because I'm not just exposing you. I'm educating them." She pointed back toward town, toward every camera, every child, every neighbor who now knew what the game was. "You thought silence was your shield," she said. "Turns out, truth is louder." Gideon stared at her, then said 4 words that chilled her to the bone. "This isn't over, Lydia," and got back in the car. The door shut. The engine purred. The car rolled out of the garage, vanishing into the Atlanta night. Lydia stood still and whispered back, "No, Gideon, it's just beginning." Rain poured down on Asheville like the heavens themselves had been stirred by the truth. Thunder rolled across the skies, echoing the storm already raging in the hearts of its people. But no one was hiding. Not anymore. The town had erupted in solidarity. From street murals to sidewalk chalk messages, one phrase had become Asheville's heartbeat. "We stand with Lydia." It was painted on windows, worn on shirts, written on signs. But Lydia Carrington wasn't interested in glory. She was preparing for the final blow, the day after her midnight confrontation with Gideon. Federal agents, now armed with a full data dump from the runner's phone, began sweeping through city records across 5 states. Indictments rolled out like thunderclaps. Bankers, notaries, developers, and lawyers suddenly found themselves under investigation or behind bars. Judge Mallory, now in protective custody, had turned state's witness. His detailed testimony confirmed everything: the bribes, the threats, the property grabs. He confessed with tears in his eyes and shaking hands. "I thought I was controlling it," he told Lydia in a private deposition. "But I was just one of his pens." Gideon never needed a gavel, he'd fear. But Lydia didn't want his tears. She wanted closure. Tessa sat at the kitchen table back at the safe house, scrolling through a flood of messages, emails, tweets, calls from journalists, community leaders, and even legal scholars across the nation. "They're calling you the Rosa Parks of land justice," she said, shaking her head. "Even Harvard's asking if you return as a guest lecturer." Lydia smiled faintly. "If I go back, it'll be to teach them how to burn the whole system down, with books, not flames." Martin walked in holding a flash drive. "I got something," he said. "Someone inside Gideon's camp dropped it anonymously. It's not a trap. Checked it twice." "What is it?" Lydia asked. He handed it to her. Proof that Gideon's still operating, but under a new identity. He's already set up a fresh network, clean, international, offshore accounts. New shell companies, different names, same game. He's just shifting the battlefield. Lydia's face hardened. So he wasn't bluffing. "No," Martin said. "He was planning his next war while we were still cleaning up his last one." Tessa's eyes scanned the new data. "And look at this," one of the companies, New Horizon Infrastructure, just bought up 30 acres in Montgomery, Alabama, low-income area, historic black neighborhood, plans to build smart housing complexes. "That's not housing," Lydia said. "That's a razor in a nice suit." She stood up slowly, straightened her shoulders. "We stop him." Martin leaned back. "We don't even know where he is." Lydia smiled without warmth. "Yes, we do." 3 nights later, in a sleek private lounge at a tech summit in Miami, William Faulkner sat at a small table nursing a glass of scotch. His hair was slicked back, his expensive suit wrinkle-free, but his eyes were jittery. He hadn't been seen publicly since the Asheville reveal. But here, he was surrounded by a different crowd: billionaires, urban developers, foreign investors. Then a man approached him, tall, polished, calm, Gideon. But now he was wearing a new name: Simon Rourke, international consultant, CEO of a green development startup. Faulkner stood up immediately. "They're coming for you," he said. "Carrington, she's at teeth. I told you this would happen." Gideon chuckled and poured himself a drink. "She's a storm, yes, but storms blow over." Faulkner leaned in. "She's not blowing over. She's gaining speed." Gideon met his eyes. "Then it's time we change tactics." He reached into his coat and handed Faulkner a silver phone. "Use this. 1 number. No text. No trail. If we're going to stay ahead, we need to think faster. Strike cleaner." Faulkner took it nervously. "You sure we're not too exposed?" Gideon sipped his drink. "Not yet." But what neither of them saw was the woman at the bar. Sunglasses, curly silver hair tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat, recording everything with a device no bigger than a lipstick tube. Lydia Carrington, watching, listening, waiting. Back in Asheville, the DOJ task force had grown. With Lydia's help, they weren't just reacting anymore. They were hunting. She'd named a new initiative herself, Project Caroline, because she never got to fight back, Lydia explained. "So now we fight for her, for every person who lost their home while the world looked the other way." Martin nodded. "I like it." Tessa added, "And the logo's going to be a fence, not torn down, rebuilt." News broke the following day. International Criminal Task Force launches Project Caroline to investigate global property theft rings. But Gideon had already vanished again. He was always 3 steps ahead. Until now, because Lydia didn't want to chase him anymore. She wanted to trap him, using the data from the runner's phone and the flash drive from the anonymous source. Lydia, Tessa, and Martin built a map of Gideon's assets, his money, his companies, his routes. And then they picked his most valuable project, Montgomery. Gideon's plan was to launch $1 billion development there, one that would displace 3,000 families under promise of economic revitalization. So Lydia flew there. She knocked on doors, held community meetings, shared her story. Within a week, she had the city on fire. Protests, investigations, calls for transparency. People started pulling out of Gideon's deal. Investors walked. The city council suspended permits. And suddenly, Gideon's silence cracked. He sent a message. One line. You're becoming a nuisance, Lydia. Let's meet. Martin read the message out loud. Tessa looked horrified. No, it's not safe. But Lydia just said, tell him where. The meeting was set in Selma, Alabama, on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Historic, symbolic, risky. At dawn, Lydia stood in the center of the bridge wearing her gray coat and holding a folder of final evidence. Photos, account links, a ledger of stolen homes from Asheville to Baton Rouge. Gideon arrived in a black car. Alone, he walked slowly toward her. No words at first. Then, why do you keep chasing me, Professor? This isn't your fight anymore. Lydia stepped forward, the wind whipping around her. It was never just mine. This is every fight our ancestors bled for. You think this bridge is just history? It's a warning. Gideon's eyes narrowed. You won't win. I already have, she said, because you came here. Because you're afraid of what happens if this goes to trial. He laughed bitterly. You think a trial will stop this machine? No, she said, but it will expose it. And once people see the machine, they stop feeding it. Then she handed him the folder, every piece of evidence, already sent to the Attorney General. This meeting? Just a courtesy. Gideon opened the folder. His hands trembled. You'll regret this. No, Lydia said softly. You will. And she walked away. As she crossed the bridge, camera drones rose into the sky, live streaming, broadcasting, every step, a symbol, a reckoning, a professor who stood taller than the system that tried to silence her. And the storm hadn't blown over. It had only just begun. 1 year later, Asheville was no longer the same town it had been when Lydia Carrington first stepped off the train, with aching knees and quiet grief in her heart. Where once there were whispers and shrugged shoulders, now there was action, purpose, fire. The courthouse had been repainted, both literally and figuratively. The old judge's bench now sat in a museum display, behind glass labeled The Tipping Point. Lydia stood on the steps of the rebuilt Carrington house. The frame was new, but the swing set had been restored from parts salvaged from the ashes. The hydrangeas were blooming again, and so was justice. In the months following her meeting with Gideon on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, Project Caroline became a national movement. Federal prosecutors across 6 states began unsealing indictments against dozens of figures linked to the Clean Sweep Network. The runner, eventually identified as Nolan West, testified in exchange for immunity and gave a full breakdown of the entire web. William Faulkner was arrested in a quiet raid at a private airport in Barbados. The moment was live-streamed. His hands cuffed, sunglasses removed, expression blank. He was sentenced to 35 years for racketeering, conspiracy, and wire fraud. As for Gideon, real name, Elliot Greaves, he didn't vanish into shadow this time. Instead, Lydia's evidence pushed the Department of Justice to designate him a national economic threat. International warrants were issued. 2 of his offshore accounts were frozen by a joint U.S. Swiss effort. Then came the mistake. He tried to board a private flight under a false identity in Luxembourg. Interpol took him down in the terminal. No dramatics, just quiet handcuffs and a final photograph that would circle the globe. The face of a man who thought he was untouchable, finally grounded. He was extradited, tried in the United States. And in the courtroom where he once ruled from behind curtains, he now sat in silence as Lydia Carrington testified against him. I am not here to punish you, she said calmly to the court. I am here to remind you that land carries stories, that homes carry voices, and that those voices, even when buried, always rise. Greaves received a sentence of life without parole, but it was what happened after that shook the nation most. The U.S. Congress passed the Community Land Justice Act, inspired by Project Caroline, to protect vulnerable communities from silent displacement. It mandated transparency in property sales, restricted shell company purchases of residential land, and created a National Land Rights Oversight Board. Lydia was offered a seat on that board. She declined. Instead, she started a foundation in Caroline's name, Carrington Roots, to fund legal aid for families facing eviction and land theft. Tessa became the foundation's executive director. Martin returned to the DOJ full-time, leading the very task force he'd once formed in secret. And Lydia? She returned to teaching. But not at Harvard. No, she went home to a small community college in Asheville. Every Tuesday and Thursday, she taught young minds about constitutional law and civil rights, her voice steady and warm, her examples drawn not from textbooks, but from fire, ash, and rebirth. On the first day of her class, she wrote on the blackboard, "The law isn't just rules. It's roots. Protect yours." One afternoon, as Lydia sat on the porch sipping tea, she looked down at Caroline's old prayer journal. The pages were still warped, the ink still faded in places. But one line remained clear: "Give me the strength to stand firm, even when I stand alone." Lydia closed the book gently. She wasn't standing alone anymore. Children played in the yard next door. The church bells rang downtown, and the swing set creaked softly in the breeze, as if Caroline were rocking in time with the wind. The storm had come. The storm had passed. And out of the ruins, she had built something stronger than fear. She had built justice.